Hey guys, it's me, Miss Alceda, and this is Chapter 4, Colonial Society. Conquest by the cradle. So, a distinguishing characteristic shared by these colonies is going to be massive population growth. By 1700, there were fewer than 300,000 people, about 20,000 of whom were black. 5 years later, 2.5 million people lived in the colonies. White immigrants were nearly 400,000, and then the black enslaved were about the same. Now, the colonists were doubling their numbers every 25 years. So, every 25 years, it's going to just massively increase to the point that by 1775, the average age was about 16. 1700, there were 20 English subjects for each American colonist, and the balance of power was shifting. And as you can see from this, I'm trying to fix the camera. As you can see from this very pixelated graph, you can see that population is going to just completely expand. Now, the most populous colonies by 1775, of course, were Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Maryland in that order. Four cities of any significant size: Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, and Charleston. 90% of colonists did live in rural areas and did not live in the city. So the city was 5 to 10% of the population. America by this time was already a melting pot because everybody who came to the British colonies were immigrants. Okay, just everybody came from a different area. Germans were about 6%, or roughly 150,000 by 1775. Now, the reason they came to America was they fled religious persecution, they fled economic oppression, and of course, war in the 1700s. And they're going to settle primarily in Pennsylvania. Their religion is going to be Lutheran, and they're going to be known as the Pennsylvania Dutch. Okay? Scots Irish are going to be about 175,000, or 7% of the population. Although non-English, they did speak English. Their economic life had been hampered in the 1700s. Tens of thousands did make their way to America, and they became the first settlers of the West. They're going to come up against the Allegheny Mountains. They're going to move southward to Maryland and down Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, and they are going to be building flimsy log cabins. And here you can see a picture of the Paxton Boys. About 5% of the Europeans were French Huguenots, the Welsh, the Dutch, the Swedes, etc. 49% of the population was Anglo-Saxon, as you can see from the chart right there. Africans were the largest non-English group that was brought to the New World. 20% of the colonial population was African by 1775, and the South had 90% of the slaves. New England had the least ethnic diversity. Most of them were English. The middle colonies, specifically Pennsylvania, are going to receive the bulk of the later white immigrants. Outside of the New England area, one half were non-English. In fact, of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 18 were non-English and 8 weren't even born in the colonies. And here you can see that graph better. Excuse me. These immigrants are going to lay the foundation for the new multicultural American standard and identity that we have today. The African American community is going to be variegated in its cultural origins. In the deepest South, however, slave life is going to be severe. The climate is hostile to your health. The labor was life-draining, especially on the hardworking plantations. And in the rice and the indigo plantations, they had a lonely life. Blacks in the growing Chesapeake area, of course, this is the Jamestown area, not Massachusetts, Maryland and Virginia, tobacco plantations were the primary source. The size is going to permit slaves more visits with friends. So again, the larger the plantation, the more, I don't want to say freedom the Africans had, but the less likely that they would be prone to cruelty. The cruelty was there, of course. The most extreme cases were a small percentage, but there was cruelty with slavery in every single household. The population of female slaves rose by 1720, and because of that, family life is going to be possible because you do need women to have babies. Growth was then natural increase by population. The number of slaves in the North is going to grow as well. The language Gullah evolved among the South Carolinian blacks. Slaves are going to help build their country with labor. Most of them are going to be manual laborers, but we did have some artisans. In 1712, there was a New York slave revolt, we'll get to in a bit. And in 1739, we had the South Carolina slave revolt on the Stono River, which we called the Stono Rebellion. Now, society is going to be very hierarchical. When people were coming to America, it felt like America was the land of equality and opportunity, and it kind of was, except for slavery. On the eve of revolution, we were showing signs of that stratification and barriers to mobility, meaning if you were in the super low class, the labor class, it was really difficult for you to work your way up. Wars are going to enrich merchant princes in New England and the middle colonies. And because we had so many wars, a class of widows and orphans is going to be created. In New England, with open land less available, descendants are going to face limited prospects. Farms are going to get smaller. Younger children are going to be hired out as wage laborers. And of course, Boston, one of the largest cities, their homeless poor is going to increase. In the South, large plantations continue their disproportionate ownership of slaves. Lower classes are going to be further swelled by the stream of indentured servants that we mentioned in chapter 2 and 3. Many, of course, did achieve prosperity to sign the Declaration of Independence. So yes, it was possible. Less fortunate, however, were 50,000 paupers and convicts that were shipped to America against their will. At the very bottom of the hierarchy of society, of course, were the black slaves. They enjoyed no equality with the whites. They were oppressed, they were downtrodden, and a lot of white colonists are going to be concerned at the number of the slaves that are in America because they're starting to realize that they're going to be outnumbered. And one of the biggest fears was the slaves realizing that they outnumbered the white man and could probably do something about it. British authorities resisted any attempt to limit the transatlantic trade because what's the bottom line? Money. Here is an advertisement for a slave auction. Colonial professions, most honored, of course, was the Christian ministry. If you were in the clergy, then you were up on top. Most physicians were very poorly trained. They read a couple of books, studied under a physician, and suddenly they're a physician. First, medical school wasn't even established until 1765. A lot of doctors are going to serve as apprentices under other ones, and lawyers aren't going to be regarded highly. In fact, we didn't really need lawyers. If you had a legal problem, you worked it out by yourself on your own. So workday, 90% of people did have a job regarding or in the industry agriculture. Tobacco, of course, was the main crop of Maryland and Virginia. The breadbasket colonies are going to produce a lot of grain, and overall Americans are going to have a much higher standard of living than the masses of any other country. Fishing is going to be below agriculture, but they are going to have great commerce. Commercial ventures are going to be there. Now, triangular trade, called triangular trade because it was in the shape of a triangle, is going to be super profitable. Manufacturing was of secondary importance. Skilled craftspeople were very few and far between, and they were highly prized. So most of America during the colonial times were uneducated, unskilled. So if you did have a skill or something, then you were really good. You were really in demand. Lumbering was the most important because you had to build buildings, you had to build boats and ships, and that was one of the biggest ones. Naval stores are also going to be highly valued. In 1733, however, the British Parliament is going to pass the Molasses Act to try to put down the French West Indies American trade. We are going to say, and then we're going to smuggle. This foreshadowed the impending imperial crisis. And here you can see the triangular trade. I'm going to try to fix the camera one last time. Okay, and here you can see that in the map. Now, America is going to have a scarcity of money and workers. Roads did not connect to the major cities until the 1700s. So you're going to have a lot of isolated towns. There were often clouds of dust in the summer and quagmires of mud in the winter because of the heavy rainfall. Dangers are going to include tree-strewn roads, rickety bridges, carriage overturns, runaway horses. It was just problems galore. It was so much easier to travel by sea. Populations are going to cluster along the banks of navigable rivers because going by land was just impossible. Taverns are going to spring up along the main routes. And you know what they sell in taverns? Alcohol. Gossip is going to gather at these taverns. And this is going to be where it, like the foundation of the independence movement, where people would get together and drink and talk about how upset they were at the government. And this is how the independence movement and radical ideas are going to come around. And then, by the 1700s, we are going to have intercolonial postal system. Here you can see one of the taverns. And if you've ever seen Game of Thrones, then you know that the taverns often had like rooms to rent, and people would stay in them on their travels and then move on. In 1775, Anglican and Congregationals are going to be the tax-supported established church of the colonies. Most didn't worship in a church, and the colonies that did have established churches, only a minority belonged. So by this time in 1775, you do not have a really well-established church attendance by numbers. And if you look here, you can see, a lot of these churches were disestablished in the 1700s, the Anglican Church, Congregational. And then here you could see by 1775, the census of the different denominations. So the population was about 2.4 million, but only 1.8 attended church. So only 74% of the colonists actually belonged to a church. Most of them, though, were Congregationalists. Now, the Church of England, which we mentioned in chapter 2 and 3 with the creation of the Church of England after Henry VIII separated, they were called Anglicans, and their official faith is going to be in Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, and part of New York. In England, it was a major prop of kingly authority. I don't know what that means, but it's there. In America, the Anglican Church did fall short of its promise to be a better religion than the Catholic Church and to separate from the Catholic Church. It was less fierce and more worldly than the Puritans' version of evangelicalism. And the sermons, of course, were shorter. In 1693, the College of William and Mary is going to be established in Virginia to better train the clergy. Because remember, the highest occupation you could have is the clergy. The Congregational Church is going to grow out of the Puritan Church. It's going to formally be established in New England, except Rhode Island, because Rhode Island was very tolerant. And at first, it is going to be supported by taxing all the residents, but Congregational and Presbyterian ministers are going to find conflict with that. And for the time, religious toleration is going to be allowed in the colonies. In all colonial churches, religion is going to be less fervid in the early 18th century than before. The Puritans, in particular, are going to have two major problems: the theological doctrines that they had to follow and the membership requirements to become a member of the church. Clerical intellectualism did sap the spiritual vitality. Arminianism is going to be challenging the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. He said all humans, not just the elect, can be saved by God's grace. So remember in the other chapter, I want to say chapter 3, when I mentioned that you had to be saved by God and be one of the elect. Arminianism said everybody can be saved. And this is going to be considered a heresy. This is going to get Anne Hutchinson banned from Massachusetts Bay. Okay, now the Great Awakening, the fun part. This is going to be started by Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts. Sermon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is going to be his greatest lecture. And he says, we are all spiders hanging on a thin web. And anytime God wants to, he can just get scissors or a knife and just cut the web and send us straight into the fires of hell and damnation for all of eternity. if he wanted to, and if he didn't want to, he wouldn't. He said Christians must depend solely on God's grace. So he is going to be an old light pastor. So when you compare the Bible, the Christian Bible has two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament says God is vengeful, God is angry, God is punishing, do what he says or he will smite you. The New Testament is God loves you, he sent his son for you, he forgives you. So these are the two different ones. So the old lights are going to be the old school preachers who said, you're going to burn in hell, sorry. And the new lights are going to say, no, God loves you. All you have to do is ask for forgiveness and it is yours. So who do you think is going to have more support? Exactly. Congregationalists and Presbyterians are going to be split over the issue, and most of them, therefore, are going to join new churches such as the Baptists or the Methodists. Here you can see a picture of Jonathan Edwards. Do you see the dog? Do you see the dog in the painting? I love seeing the dogs. In Jonathan Edwards' sinner speech, he says, "O sinner, consider the fearful danger you're in. It is a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit, full of the fire of wrath that you are held over in the hand of that God, whose wrath is provoked and incensed as much against you as against many of the damned in hell. You hang by a slender thread with the flames of divine wrath flashing about and ready every moment to singe it and burn it asunder. And you have no interest in any mediator and nothing to lay hold of to save yourself, nothing to keep off the flames of wrath, nothing of your own, nothing that you have ever done, nothing you can do to induce God to spare you one moment. Nothing you can do will save you. It's God's decision." So the effects of the Great Awakening, the emphasis is going to be placed on direct emotive spirituality, and it's going to undermine the old lights. I don't know if it's in a coming slide, but the new light leader was George Whitefield. Many schisms increase the number and competitiveness, so more churches are going to branch out because of the Great Awakening. It's going to encourage new waves of missionary work, people going out of their ways to convert people and save people. And it is going to lead to the founding of colleges. It's the first spontaneous mass movement in the colonies, and it is going to lead to a growing sense of Americanism. Speaking of education, education is going to be first reserved for a very select few in the aristocracy. It should not be for leadership or citizenship, and it was mostly for males. Puritans were more zealous in education than others were, and the goal of the clergy was first and foremost to make good Christians rather than good citizens. A more secular approach was evident by the 1800s. Now, education for the gentlemen is going to flourish. New England did establish schools, but the quality and length of instruction is going to vary by area. Because the South relied so heavily on plantations, they're not going to focus on education. They're going to focus on planting. They're going to focus on, what's the bottom line? Money. Wealthy Southern families are going to have private tutors for their sons who, of course, didn't work in the field. And here you can see a drawing. Nice. You see the dog? The general atmosphere in schools and colleges was grim and gloomy. They emphasized religion and the classical languages like Greek and Latin. They focused on doctrine and dogma, not reason and experiment, not science or anything. Discipline was super severe, and education is going to be specifically preparing men for the ministry, for the clergy. That was the only reason one would go to college. 9 colleges are going to be established during the colonial era, and we're going to see that in Table 5.3. Student enrollments were small, about 200. Instruction was poor. Curriculum was heavily loaded with dead languages that nobody knew. And by 1750, there's going to be a trend toward live languages. Like, hey, here's a thought. Maybe we should learn in the language that other people speak. Let's just try it. Benjamin Franklin is going to help launch the University of Pennsylvania, the first college that had no connection to a church, the first secular college in America. So here you can see Harvard in Table 5.3 in Cambridge, very first church that was established. William and Mary in Virginia, Yale, Princeton, Penn State, Columbia, Brown, Rutgers, and Dartmouth. Um, these all look like Ivy League schools. Okay. Art and culture is still going to have European taste, especially from the British. Colonial contributors, John Trumbull was the painter. He is super famous because he's the one who painted the famous painting on the back of the $2 bill, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He's the one who painted Washington crossing the Delaware with Madison holding onto the flag. You know, he's a pretty big deal. Charles Wilson Peale is known for his very famous portrait of George Washington. He ran a museum. Benjamin West and John Copley were famous painters as well, and you can see their artwork here. I love the one here on the top right where he's painting somebody and the person he's painting is looking at you and he's looking at you and the girl that's in the background is looking at you. It's like everybody's looking at you, even the painting. I love it. Architecture was largely imported and modified to meet peculiar conditions. The log cabin is going to be something we borrowed from the Swedes. The red brick Georgian style is going to be introduced in 1720. You know, everybody is going to have one by then. Literature is going to be Phyllis Wheatley, the first, I don't want to say first, but she was an African slave who did write a book of poetry. And then Benjamin Franklin and his Poor Richard's Almanac that he wrote in a pseudonym. Science was slowly making progress. A few botanists, some mathematicians, a smattering of astronomers. And Franklin is going to be the only first-rank scientist that the colonies produced in America. Americans were too poor to buy books, so we are going to have one of the first printing presses. The Byrd family of Virginia, a wealthy family, is going to have the largest collection of books, about 4,000. Franklin's going to establish in Philadelphia the first privately supported circulating library. And by 1776, there were about 50 libraries that you could become a member of and you could check books out. The very first printed pamphlets, leaflets, and other journals are going to start being printed and distributed. Right before the American Revolution, we had 40 newspapers that existed in the colonies, and newspapers were a vital tool to help spread information from colony to colony. The Zenger trial is going to be a tricky case. John Peter Zenger is going to assail the corrupt royal governor, and he is going to say bad things about him, which were true. So the governor is going to have him arrested and is going to charge him with libel. Slander is when you say something. Libel is when you print it. Now, this decision is going to help establish the doctrine that true statements about public officials cannot be libel. So the jury is going to say not guilty. Everything he printed about the royal governor is true. That's not libel, it's true. And that is going to set the precedent for freedom of the press in the colonies. It pointed the way for open discussion required by diverse society. 3 colonial governors. So by 1775, we had 8 colonies that had royal governors that were specifically appointed by the king. 3 of them were proprietors, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Connecticut and Rhode Island had their own self-governing charters. Of course, Connecticut had the fundamental orders. Now, each colony did have a 2-house legislature. The upper house was appointed by the crown in 8 royal colonies and the proprietor in 3 proprietary colonies. And of course, it was chosen by the voters in the Connecticut and Rhode Island, the 2 most diverse ones. Lower houses was the popular branch elected by the people that owned land. And in some colonies, the backcountry areas were seriously underrepresented, as is today. Self-taxation through representation was a privilege that Americans enjoyed. They didn't have to pay anything to Parliament because Parliament didn't rule them. They had their own governments. Colonial assemblies are going to have authority over governors, and they started withholding their salaries. Like, we don't pay you. The king may have appointed you. We're not going to pay you. Administration is going to vary by levels. County governments are going to be in the south, town meetings in the north, and the middle colonies are going to use a mixture of the 2. The ballot was by no means a birthright. So just because you were born a male does not mean you were allowed to vote. Upper classes are going to be afraid of the lower classes voting, and they were unwilling to grant the ballot to them because they were afraid that if the poor people were able to vote, They would pass laws that would help themselves. A wild thought. In 1775, there were still religious qualifications and property qualifications for voting. Half of the men in the colonies couldn't even vote. The right to vote wasn't impossible because all you had to do was buy land, and that in itself was not impossible. Eligible voters didn't exercise their privilege because they just did what the elite told them. By 1775, we weren't really a true democracy. Most colonies, though, were more democratic than all of Europe. Everyday life is going to be drab and tedious. Food was plentiful, but the diet was coarse and bland. And it's like you had the same thing every day. You had the same thing every day. They didn't have the basic comforts, and amusement was, well, who had time to do anything? Nobody had time for anything. By 1775, North America did look like a patchwork quilt. Each colony was different, but they were all stitched together with common origins, a common way of life, and they all believed in the same things. But they were physically separated from imperial authority. This is all going to change. And this is all going to change with the duel for North America, what I call the French and Indian War. Now, France, if you recall, was a latecomer in the scramble for the New World real estate. It was convulsed by foreign wars, and it was involved in a lot of clashes. One of the worst was the clash between the French Catholics and the French Protestants, known as the Huguenots. On St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, massacre 10,000 Huguenots, men, women, even innocent children, are going to be butchered in cold blood. And there's a painting on the next slide that shows it. So in 1598, a year later, the Edict of Nantes is going to be issued by the crown, and it's going to grant toleration to the Huguenots. We don't like you, but we're going to make it illegal for people to kill you in the streets. We still don't like you. France is going to blossom. They're going to have brilliant ministers. And by the time Louis XIV is king, who reigns for 72 years, everybody's going to be happy. Faithful for North America, he took a deep interest in overseas colonies. Here is the painting from St. Bartholomew's Day, where you can see the people in the street. Thankfully, there's no children in this painting. In 1608, the permanent beginnings of a French empire were beginning. They were led by Samuel de Champlain, the father of New France. He established friendly relationship with Huron Indian tribes, and they are going to have a trade agreement with them. Now, the government of New France in Canada is going to fall under direct control of the king. It is going to be almost completely autocratic. There was no representative assemblies. They did not have a trial by jury like the English colonies did. And the population of Catholic New France is going to grow slowly. So New France is Catholic. England is Protestant and hates Catholics, in case you are wondering what's coming up. Landowning French peasants had little motive to move, and the Huguenots were denied a refuge. So the government is going to favor its Caribbean islands. Now, New France is going to have their one valuable resource, the beaver pelt. European fashion settlers are going to have beaver pelt hats and whatnot, and the coureur de bois, I'm assuming I pronounced it incorrectly, is going to trap beavers. They littered the land with scores of place names. So you had Baton Rouge, which means red stick, Terre Haute, Highland, and Des Moines, some monks. I always wondered what that meant. French voyageurs recruited Indians into the fur business, as you'll see in the map. And the Indian fur flotilla that arrived in Montreal is going to be 400 canoes large. Many of them were decimated by the white man's disease and alcohol. Mass slaughter beavers is going to violate a lot of the Indians' religious beliefs, and it is going to cause ecological damage. But, I mean, at least they weren't stealing the natives' lands. Catholic missionaries, called Jesuits, are going to try to save the Indians for Christ. Some suffered torture by the natives. They had few converts, but they were a vital role as geographers. And they did seek neither souls nor fur. They just wanted to block England. So they said, I'm not here for the furs. I'm not here for the religion. I just don't want England and Spain to get this land. Antoine Cadillac founded Detroit, the city of straits. Cadillac. Robert de La Salle floated down the Mississippi River and claimed it. He named the interior base in Louisiana after Louis and his wife Anna. So Louise E. Anna is Louise and his wife Anna. Okay, I just love that part because, as y'all know, New Orleans is my second favorite city. He failed to find the Mississippi Delta. He landed in Spanish Texas, and of course, for that, he's going to be murdered. You don't mess with the Spanish. And here you could see him before he's murdered. The French planted several fortified posts in what is now present-day Mississippi and Louisiana. New Orleans is founded in 1718, and the forts are going to be in fertile Illinois country. So this is going to be the grain garden of France's North American Empire. Now, in King William's War, we are going to have a series of wars happening between England and France. In King William's War and Queen Anne's War, the British colonists are going to fight the coureurs de bois, and Indian allies are going to totally ravage Schenectady, New York, and Deerfield, Massachusetts, as you can see in the map. Here you can see King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War. Now, the sad thing about Queen Anne, when Queen Anne was queen, she had 19 pregnancies. None of her pregnancies resulted in a live baby, so she died without an heir. She had 19 miscarriages. And it really took a toll on her health. And with each one, she got closer to death. By the time she finally died, they had to go to a distant relation because, according to the Glorious Revolution, a Catholic could not hold the throne. So everybody else who was distantly related were Catholic. They couldn't hold the throne. George I was one of the Habsburgs of Germany, and they brought him over. Of course, his grandson, George III, is going to be all, "You'll be back." Okay, as a Hamilton joke, I'm sorry. Okay, so peace terms are going to be signed at Utrecht in 1713, and they're going to show just how badly France and its Spanish ally had been beaten. Britain is going to gain French-populated Acadia, as well as Newfoundland and the Hudson Bay, pictured there. The losses are going to put France's settlements on the St. Lawrence River, and thereby sealed their ultimate doom. American colonies are then going to experience decades of what we call salutary neglect. So this is going to be where England leaves everybody alone and then gets mad when they come back and see we did what we wanted. Like, you left us. Britain also won limited trading rights in Spanish America. The British captain Robert Jenkins is going to have one of his ears sliced off by a Spanish official, which is going to lead to the War of Jenkins' Ear in 1739. He's going to demand justice for his ear. It is going to merge with a larger War of Austrian Secession called King George's War in America. New Englanders, with the help from the British Navy, are going to capture Louisbourg, which commanded the St. Lawrence River, but it is going to be returned to France, and everybody is going to be so upset because they fought so hard for it just to be given back. Why? And then France, of course, still had a large chunk of land. And this is where it gets interesting. The Ohio Valley is going to be the biggest bone of contention. So for the British, it was a critical area for Western movement. They didn't have enough land and they wanted to move westward. The French wanted to link their land to the lower Mississippi Valley, and the British colonists are going to fight them for it. Now, the French are going to put a chain of forts along the Ohio River. The biggest one was Fort Duquesne, which is right there. And this is going to be along the Monongahela, I don't know how to say that, and the Allegheny Rivers at the Ohio River. This is going to be eventually future Pittsburgh. In 1754, the governor of Virginia is going to send a young Virginia planter royal elitist, George Washington, to secure the claim. So he is going to go, and he's going to go about 40 miles from Fort Duquesne, and he's going to fire upon them. The French leader is going to be killed and is going to retreat, and Washington thinks he won. He's going to rename the fort Fort Necessity, and he's going to be like, yeah, that was easy. I won. Pretty cool. The French are going to return, and they're going to surround Washington. And after a 10-hour siege, he's finally going to be able to surrender. He's going to be allowed to march back with his honor. They could have killed him, and they let him retreat. In response, the British are going to brutally uproot the French Acadians and scatter them as far as Louisiana, and that is where we get the Cajuns from. So George Washington, total miscalculation. The first three Anglo-French colonial wars are going to start in Europe, but the fourth one is going to start in America, and that is going to be the French and Indian War. It started with Washington at Fort Duquesne. It's going to widen into the 7 Years' War, and it's going to involve America, Europe, the West Indies, Africa, the Philippines, and the ocean. It's going to be a 7-sea war. In 1754, the British government is going to summon an intercolonial congress to meet. Only 7 delegates are going to be sent. The purpose was to control Iroquois tribes loyal to Britain and to form some kind of General Assembly to oversee the colonial response. They are going to be led by, among other people, Benjamin Franklin, who has his famous join or die speech. Here's a map. His famous join or die, I said speech and I meant engraving. So at this Albany Congress, he's going to publish his famous join or die cartoon. He is going to say, if we don't all stay together, then we're all going to die together. Albany delegates unanimously adopted it because we really needed to defeat the French. But the individual colonies are going to reject it, and so are the British, because nobody in the colonies wanted to give up their autonomy. To colonists, it did not give enough independence. To the British, it gave too much. So Franklin's going to observe everybody agreed on it, but they were distracted on the little details, and that is why it failed. Now, the opening clashes, Braddock's blunders, my goodness. General Edward Braddock is going to be sent to Virginia after Washington with a strong detachment of British regulars. Remember, regulars is the regular standing army. Keep that in mind when we go over Paul Revere. He set out with 2,000 men to capture Fort Duquesne. On his way, he met a smaller French and Indian army. Washington had 2 horses shot out from under him. 4 bullets pierced his coat. It wasn't his time, you guys. Braddock is going to be fatally wounded and is going to die from his wounds. The British are going to be routed and they're going to suffer humiliating losses. The Indians are going to launch assaults from Pennsylvania to North Carolina because they're like, we beat the British? Get out of here. We're like the main, and they just totally went with that. Washington, with 300 men, tried to defend the frontier, but the British are just going to have defeat after defeat after defeat until William Pitt comes along. So William Pitt is Britain's superlative leader. He was known as the Great Commoner. He is going to downplay the assaults and say, so what? We lost. We didn't try to win. He concentrated on Quebec, Montreal area. He picked young and energetic military leaders. He is going to dispatch an expedition that took Louisbourg back from the French. And this is going to be a massive British victory. He's going to send James Wolfe to take Quebec. He's going to battle Marquis de Montcalm's forces. And both commanders are going to be fatally wounded and are going to die of their wounds. At the Battle of Quebec, one of the most significant battles in British and American history, when Montreal fell in 1760, the French flag fluttered for its last time in Canada. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 is going to be signed, and it is going to give all of the continental land, most of the continental land, no, I think it's all of the continental land, to England. They were able to maintain several small but valuable sugar islands like Haiti. France also received 2 islets in Gulf of St. Lawrence for fishing. But France, because Spain helped France, even though they lost, Spain is going to get all land west of the Mississippi. So all land east is going to go to England, and all land west is going to go to Spain. And there's a map coming up. Britain is going to emerge as the dominant power in North America and the leading world naval power. So here you can see the before and after. So France used to own all that was in green. England had the little yellows. Most of that went to England. Again, everything east of the Mississippi went to England. Everything west went to Spain. And then Russia had their little piece of Alaska. Britain's colonists did emerge with increased confidence. 20,000 colonists were under arms. War shattered the myth of British invincibility. So everybody thought Britain was, invincible. And this was like, no, they're not. They can be beaten. Displayed the contempt of professional soldiers. The British refused to recognize any American militia above captain. Why though? British officials were really upset that the colonists didn't put full effort into it. And a lot of them are going to be self-centered and alienated from the war. They don't want to provide troops or any money to the war because it wasn't their war. But they are going to have some strong tendencies towards, and it says on the bottom, independence. Who's this guy? I know you know who this guy is. That's George Washington. Unity among colonies did receive some encouragement. Soldiers and statesmen from different colonies met. They discovered they were all Americans who spoke the same language and shared common ideals, and they were a coherent nation. And that is going to be one of the biggest factors that leads to the American Revolution. Removal of French menace meant that America had all of this land to themselves. The Spanish and the Indian threats were reduced significantly. Spanish removed themselves from Florida and the French removed themselves from Canada, so it was all England all around. And because of this, there is going to be one last hurrah. The native tribe leader Pontiac, Ottawa Chief Pontiac, is going to seize Detroit in 1763, and he's going to overrun all but 3 British posts that were west of the Appalachians. About 2,000 soldiers and settlers are going to be killed. The British are going to retaliate with a primitive version of biological warfare in which they give the natives blankets that are infected with smallpox. Yeah, we did that. Pontiac died in 1769 by a rival. Colonists were now free to cross the Appalachian Mountains and take western lands. But London doesn't want another Pontiac's rebellion to come upon them. So London is going to issue the Proclamation of 1763. This is going to ban settlement beyond the Appalachians, as you can see in this map. Britain only wanted to avoid another bloody Indian uprising. They couldn't afford it so soon after war. The colonists were upset, as they should be. The stage is going to be set for conflict. The colonists refused to be restrained, and they crossed the line anyway. And the British government was frustrated with the colonies, and they said, look, you're on your own. If you go west and the Indians kill you, don't come crying back to me. They couldn't because they'd be killed, but you know what I mean. And that is going to take us to the next chapter. Thanks for watching.